guys, what's up? I'm Sam from DIY Huntress and welcome to my shed shop. That was really high. I used to do this thing where I would talk awkwardly into the camera before my video started, like way more often. Today I'm back because I feel like I have some explaining to do. I recently asked you guys on YouTube and Instagram what kind of projects you wanted to see on my channel. And you guys came up with two really awesome ideas. First, you wanted to see projects that could be done using 2 or 3 power tools that you might find in your dad's garage or a shed, or that you purchase for a home improvement project. And the second was that you wanted to see me eventually make a cutting board without using a surface planer, because not everybody has a surface planer. So today I decided to combine those two ideas into one awesome love child and show you how I made DIY cutting boards without the use of a surface planer and with 3 power tools: a table saw, a miter saw, and a sander. Let's get started. As I mentioned in my intro, you don't need fancy tools to make really cool projects, and I use those 3 power tools I mentioned at the beginning to make these awesome hardwood cutting boards, and I'm going to show you how I did that in this video. I partnered up with my incredible friends at DAT Products to make this project come to life, and thanks to them you can find the free list of materials and plans for this project on my website by clicking on the link below this video. Before even getting started, this project really had a lot of meaning for me because a couple years ago a local woodworking shop had to move out of town, and instead of taking all of his stock with him, he donated a lot of really awesome lumber to me when I was first starting out. So I've had a lot of his lumber hanging around my shop for about 3 years now, and I knew I wanted to dig into this collection for this project. The first cutting board that I made is made out of walnut and maple, and the second one is walnut, maple, and padauk, but you'll see that the second one was an afterthought, and I'll explain why later. I don't have a jointer in my shop, and the walnut boards I was using needed some tender love and care, so I brought them over to my table saw and just squared up one edge with the table saw blade. And once that edge was square, I flipped those pieces over and cut them down to their final dimension, which ended up being about 2 inches wide. Because the walnut boards were all about the same thickness, I then just went ahead and measured them out to the same length and brought those over to my miter saw and cut them down to size. Because I wasn't using a planer for this project, it was really important that they were very similar in thickness. After cutting all of the walnut pieces, I then cut 2 maple strips into similar sizes as well. I then brought everything over to my workbench and started to lay out the pieces. Now, the maple pieces I used were taller than the walnut pieces, so I marked where I needed to trim them, brought them to my table saw, and cut them down to a really similar size. It was really important for me to make sure that everything was of similar size and thickness because I'm not using a planer and I'm going to be sanding later, and this is going to make sanding so much easier. After cutting everything down to size, I just laid out the pieces on my workbench and started flipping around boards until I found a pattern that I was really happy with. Because I don't have a jointer, there were some gaps in between some of the boards, so I flipped those boards on their side and used a sander with 120 grit sandpaper just to gently knock down any of the high spots. I didn't want to use anything too aggressive because it might take off too much material, and some of the gaps will be filled in with the wood glue later and the clamps, so I didn't go too crazy, but I wanted to make sure that everything was as straight as possible before moving on to glue up. Following sanding, I set aside a station for glue up where I laid out some parallel clamps and then placed the boards on top of the clamps. I then flipped them all on their side to prep for the glue. When it came time for glue, I did not hold back. I really placed a lot of glue on these boards because I wanted the glue up to be super strong. I also made sure to evenly spread out the glue across each board so that every nook and cranny was accounted for. Oh crap, I wasn't supposed to put glue on that one. Okay. I did get a little too glue happy and accidentally glued the last piece, which was not supposed to have any glue on it at all, so I just wiped it off with a damp cloth. I then flipped all of the boards over and prepared for the clamping process. It was really important that all of the boards were touching the bottom of the clamps and that the glue up was as straight as possible to prevent any cupping, because we're not using a planer, so I needed this board to be as straight as possible as it dried. Once the clamps were tight, I then used a damp paper towel to wipe away any of the excess glue. I also added a few extra clamps to help keep the board flat while drying. About 24 hours after glue up, I came back and removed the clamps from the piece. I then immediately started the sanding process, but it was about here in the editing process that I realized I forgot to press record when I first started sanding. So I decided to backtrack and make a second board, which is the other board that I spoke about at the beginning of the video. So in an effort to show you the actual process of sanding, after gluing up the second board, I clamped it to my workstation and began a pretty long sanding process. I started with 80 grit sandpaper to flatten one side of the cutting board and remove any of the excess glue. And once I was pretty happy with how flat it was, I brought it to my miter saw and just trimmed it down to size. After trimming both of the boards to size, I continued the sanding process with 80 grit until both sides were pretty flat and I was happy with them. I then worked my way to 120 grit, where I rounded over the edges of the board using the sander instead of a router because I really wanted to get this done with 3 tools. One thing that I wanted to share was that my second board did have a couple of knots and cracks in it, so I did use some tinted epoxy to fill in those cracks, and then after that epoxy dried, I then sanded it down with my sander. After getting everything down to 120 grit, my job was not yet done. I went ahead and just sanded both of the boards all the way to 220 grit. To help prevent the cutting boards from becoming rough to the touch after the first wash, I added some water to the boards to raise the grain, and once that dried, I sanded the boards back down to 220. I then finished them both off with a cutting board oil, and I completely fell in love with the grain and the tone and just everything about these cutting boards. I let that oil soak in and then wiped away any excess after about 15 minutes. I'm really happy with the way these cutting boards turned out, even though I didn't use my surface planer, and if anything, I hope this project shows you that you can make really cool things without fancy tools. If you liked this project and this video and you want to see more, please make sure to subscribe to my channel. In the meantime, I will see you next time with a new video, and happy DIYing.